This episode of New Politics was released on the 20th of March, 2026, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
If these strikes on Iran by the United States and Israel are meant to stabilise the region, well, why have they created a global oil shock and pushed prices up to $3 a litre? And 3 weeks on, why does no one seem to know what the United States is actually trying to achieve? This isn't creating stability, it's a big miscalculation by Donald Trump and the United States, and Australia is already paying the price. I'm Eddie Djokovic.
I'm David Lewis. All of this is coming up in this big episode of New Politics.
And David, it just seems like when there is a war, well, we're sort of expected to take sides. And I just feel that the mainstream media has been really lacking in its reporting on all of this. It's mainly from the focus of the United States and the Australian government's perspective. And it's almost verging on propaganda. And in some cases, it actually is propaganda. And I think this is when independent media that's not affiliated with either corporate interests or the government becomes really, really important, so the public gets a different perspective of what's really going on. And David, in New Politics, well, we don't provide breaking news, but we do provide analysis and interpret all of those events from a different perspective. And I think that's why it's important to support independent media. And for New Politics, well, it's just $5 per month. That's less than the price of a cup of coffee. It's about a quarter of a falafel roll. I've done all the measurements for all of this beforehand. It's half the cost of a bucket of chips, so it's not really much at all. And if you're not supporting us, well, support other independent media, because if you support one, you support all of us.
We try and keep the conversation going in a real and not affected by vested. There's no big billionaire telling us what to think. There's no organisation behind us shaping our arguments. We are genuinely independent, as are many of the independent sites. You can always tell when they're not, but it's important. Australia's media laws are a mess. It can be argued the people running the media in Australia aren't actually fit and proper people under the legislation. And then we have all kinds of inaccuracies and slants and misinformation from the mainstream media. And I'm not being conspiratorial here. This is all well documented. And I don't mean that the misinformation and slants doesn't mean there's this whole overarching world conspiracy run by lizard people or anything. But it does mean that governments try to shape the agenda, and big media owners want governments to shape the agenda in their ways. So there's collusion in there. Not all the time, of course, but you'll get a much more accurate and a much more honest view from independent media. So if you can support us, please do. Try and keep independent media alive and going.
The Iran war is pushing the world's biggest economies to their limits. From the US to China to Europe, all are at risk. But which is more exposed? And what are governments doing to protect people like you and me? And the conflict has already caused the biggest energy supply shock in history. Oil prices are surging and growth forecasts are being slashed. Is the global economy heading for stagflation or even recession if the war drags on?
History has always had its fair share of incompetent world leaders, and I think we're now seeing the results of all of this incompetence, David. And the strikes by the United States and Israel on Iran, well, that was meant to supposedly stabilise the Middle East, Western Asian region, but it's done the exact opposite. It's triggered a global oil shock with petrol prices in Australia pushing up to $3 per litre. And I think this sort of thing happens when there isn't a clear strategy of what the United States is planning to do. And this is very similar to what happened with Donald Trump's tariff regime last year, where tariffs were on, then they were off, then they were on, then they were off again, on, and then the courts adjudicated that the tariffs were not actually legal. So then he looked at a different way of implementing that sort of process. And a lot of the world's markets were affected because Donald Trump did not really know what he was doing at that stage. And it's happening again with this attack on Iran, except this time around, there's not much control that the United States can have on this outcome. And there is a possibility that all of this is still part of that America first strategy where the United States is still the largest oil producer in the world and it's got massive oil reserves. So the United States might be immune from most of these effects. So they'll be okay with oil supplies themselves, but not with the prices that are going around. And it is having a massive effect on the rest of the world. The entire global supply chain system is being disrupted. And here in Australia, Australia relies on these global supply chains. And when oil prices surge on the international market, they surge here as well. And the higher oil prices lead to higher consumer goods, higher production costs of virtually everything. And it's not directly related, but we just had an interest rates rise as well. And this whole situation is likely to feed into inflation, consumer confidence, and a wide range of other issues. And all of this is being caused by the attacks of the United States and Israel on Iran. And 3 weeks on, David, we still don't know what the United States is trying to achieve with all of this. It might have some longer term goals that are not immediately clear to us, but short term, it's not going to help any of the allies of the United States. It seems like a gross miscalculation, and none of this is making the world a safer place. It's making it more volatile, and Australia is already paying the price in more ways than one.
It's wild. There are rumours swirling around. There's been reports that Ben Gurion Airport has been flattened. Suddenly it was struck. How badly that was, I don't know. There's been reports that Benjamin Netanyahu was killed in an airstrike that targeted his secret bunker, and that they've been using AI to make it seem that he's alive. There's been reports that American aircraft carriers have been sunk, since none were known to be sent to the Gulf just yet. That's a rather strong claim. And of course, the propaganda is just insanely... It's insane. It's not insanely anything. It's just purely insane.
It's insanely insane.
It's insanely insane. It makes it hard. And the reason that it's been able to fill the vacuum is because there was no end goal. Even the completely illegitimate Iraq war after the September 11 attacks had the goal of punishing the perpetrators, that the perpetrators weren't from Iraq, that it really had other things. It was really about the control of oil, and that those attacks were used as an excuse to go after someone who they didn't actually have an excuse to go over. At least they waited for the excuse to go, and they did state that these were the aims. Trump or any of his cabinet cannot give you any aims but stability. Iran, and this is not to say that we lost a great man in Khamenei, and that we've got a good guy in his successor, also Khamenei, his son, but Iran was actually pretty stable. Yes, there were resistance groups, yes, there was, etc., but it wasn't a country on the verge of collapse, unlike, say, the United States. There's no... And as someone pointed out, it took 20 years for various American governments to replace the Afghanistan Taliban with the Taliban. Only took 9 days to replace Khomeini with Khomeini. So it's been a disaster. Most serious military strategists have suggested that if America hasn't already lost the war, it's on track to losing the war, and there's no getting back to it. It has damaged Iran badly. There's no doubt about that either. It's been thousands and thousands of people and innocent people killed. There's been... Iran's infrastructure is badly damaged, but America hasn't been able to win. And it's a bit like Ukraine, in that Russia thought it'd be a 6-week campaign. 4 years later, they haven't won. There are some saying they've essentially lost. I'm not prepared to go that far. And again, the rumours there have been wild. Putin is about to be subject to a coup in which he will be defenestrated, shall we say, or a whole bunch of his advisors in general are going to take a short walk out of a long drop type thing. And of course, propaganda used to be concentrated. Now, of course, social media hits, and it's hard. And so all we know for sure in Iran is that America hasn't run. It's not been decimated, as Trump has claimed. It's not a victory. It is the best they can hope for now is a long 12-year stalemate like they had in Afghanistan, except that was 20 years. Vietnam. Hold on, do we see a pattern here?
But I guess it's that whole process of, well, politics is pretty much all about, it's a game of risk pretty much. There's always going to be risks involved. Political leaders make decisions. That's what their job is. They do have to make decisions, but they're never too sure about what the outcome is going to be. And that's just the nature of politics and of leadership. But the goal of the leader of any country is to make decisions, to make strategic decisions while they minimise the risk. And no decision is ever going to be totally risk-free, but all of this just needs to be totally filled with risk. And the United States might have the biggest military in the world, but that doesn't mean that it's got the most effective military. I think they had all of these problems with one of their aircraft carriers with blocked toilets and all that sort of stuff. It might be a big ship, but it's not an effective big ship. And it's also got the biggest economy in the world, but that doesn't mean that it's got the best economy in the world as far as working in the favour of as many people as possible that make up that economy within the United States. But also with its military, or any military, a military needs a clear direction, and also the personnel need to have a buy-in into the strategy. And this was the problem in Iraq. It was also the problem in Afghanistan. And if you want to go back further, it was a problem in Vietnam as well. The military, well, this time in Iraq, the military generals thought that this was all bullshit war. And I still remember Colin Powell at the United Nations making all of these speeches about this being a just war and all that sort of stuff. And you could tell that he didn't believe it, but they all went along with it. But when you don't have a clear rationale within the military, well, it's hard to get the military motivated. And sure, they're all professionals, so they'll do what they're told. But if you're not entirely clear about what the military intention is, well, that just makes it a lot more difficult. But the other point is that these actions have destabilised the global economy, and countries like Australia are suffering because of these reckless decisions. It's not just Australia, it's pretty much every country in the world. And ultimately, there won't be any real consequences for someone like Donald Trump. He's not facing re-election. Well, as far as we know, he's not going to be running again for election in 2028, although they do have the US midterm elections coming up in November. So there's a strong possibility that he'll just become this lame duck president after November this year. But to me, it's just this overall massive failure of leadership, not just in the United States, but also in Britain, across Europe, in Australia as well. We've just got this weak leadership all over the world, and it probably compares to pre-World War One, pre-World War II sort of thing. Good leadership is meant to stop these sorts of problems and meant to go through the process of avoiding wars, but instead we've got all this mayhem. And, it's probably because of this weak leadership that we've got globally.
Trump seems to have a pattern of not understanding that if you attack someone, that they will fight back. So he brings in the tariffs thinking that'll shut them up. They now can't afford American goods and they want American goods. What does the rest of the world do? They either raise tariffs back or they trade around. So they don't trade with the United States, they find other sources. And so then Australia finds itself having to buy US beef, which is not selling in the supermarkets. Nobody wants it because Australian beef is of a much higher quality, at least the stuff they export to the States. And Australian beef has to be made and grown, butchered and sold to certain standards that they don't have in the United States. But yeah, Trump thinks if I attack Iran, they will fold. And of course, Iran doesn't fold. If I put tariffs on, they will listen to me because I'm a strong man. And it doesn't happen.
Well, he should have learned that in the playground, that bullies will behave in a particular way, but ultimately there will be fight back.
Yeah, the second you fight back to a bully, unless...
Might not happen immediately, but it always does happen in the playground. He should have learned these lessons when he was a kid.
Yeah, apparently the character of Biff Tanner in Back to the Future was based on Donald Trump. And I don't know that it's true, but when you watch Back to the Future, you can see the resemblance. And of course, he drives the car into the manure truck and ends up covered in manure, which is what has happened with Trump anyway, with his legacy. He never had a great legacy. And had he remained a businessman when he died, they'd have remembered him as a bad businessman who wasn't terribly trustworthy. He's ruined his legacy even further by being president. The worst president of all time, according to most historians. Some still put people like Hoover and Harrison further down the list, but that's the company that Trump is keeping. I think he's the worst because It's the others, it wasn't so obviously blatant. It could get pretty blatant. What was the other bit of propaganda? California was at risk of being bombed. And when people looked at it, that came from Kash Patel, the head of the FBI, not the head of the CIA, who would be more likely to get this type of intelligence. And then people started thinking, why would they bomb California, a state that has been opposed to the war? Surely they would aim at Washington or maybe New York or one of the red states and not antagonize people who are vaguely on their side. So that threat went away very quickly once it looked like that this wasn't a credible threat from an internal enemy, that it was an incompetent mouthing off trying to get people scared.
Well, the weird thing is that we've seen this failure of leadership from Donald Trump in the past. During his first term, that was totally incompetent. During the second term, it's only been 15 months or whatever it is, 13 months that he's been in this second term, but that's been filled with incompetence as well. He introduced all of those tariffs last year under that banner of America First, but numbers and policies were announced, then unannounced, back again, challenged in the courts, reworked in a different way. That was really chaotic, and no one really knew what Donald Trump was going to do next. And a lot of his supporters were saying, oh, what a brilliant strategy. No one can understand what he's doing. But, when the president himself can't understand what he's doing, that's a real problem. And this is all being played out in exactly the same way, except with guns. And there's big consequences here. And the difference is where you can adjust tariffs or switch them on and off or fine-tune them, but you can't just switch war off like a war game or on and off or whatever. Once you start, you cannot stop, and you cannot avoid the consequences and just hope that it all just magically disappears. And I think that Iran is showing at the moment with its asymmetric warfare, it's all unconventional. It would have been preparing for this for many, many years, because the United States has telegraphed its intentions, as so has Israel, for a long time. So they've been well prepared. They're targeting energy flows, supply chains, and then they're just not engaging with traditional warfare. And I just, all of this amazes me, but I just find it hard to believe that the United States would not have understood this. And sure, if they're not going to understand it, surely there's other countries like Australia that could have pointed this out. And I really don't think you have to be a genius to point this out. And I guess getting back to Australia, this puts Australia in a real bind. It is a strong ally of the United States and probably lacks the independent thinking to do this, but it should have pointed it out to say, well, no, this is not the way to do this. This is insane, or whatever you said before, insanity. What are you thinking? But Australia might not be in a position to do this. But the other issue with President Trump is that he's asked for allies to send warships to open up or protect the Hormuz Strait. They've all said no, and they're actually making deals with Iran, and that's India and Pakistan. France is on the verge of making a deal. They're making deals with Iran to let their oil tankers go through the Strait. So it's almost like a big FU to the United States. Forget about your America First policies that are destroying the world. We are going to start looking after ourselves, and that's probably the best thing to do. Why wouldn't they do this?
Trump's big issue this time. Last time he had relatively competent people on the cabinet. Rex Tillerson had been a head of Exxon, and so he knew how the Middle East worked. He may not have been the best Secretary of State ever, and he might be in the bottom half, but he could understand, at least, even from an oil person's perspective, what was going on and how everything clicked in. Condoleezza Rice was a far superior, for example. Colin Powell was far superior. Deliberately picking Republicans here. The head of the FBI, James Comey, wasn't terribly good, but at least he understood what the FBI was for. I think he was thrown in too early, and that's why he doesn't maliciously ruin Hillary Clinton's campaign, but he ruins it by launching an investigation that didn't need to be launched and folding the pressure. The current mob, Kash Patel, clearly doesn't understand how to run an investigation. Marco Rubio doesn't understand what's going on in international politicians. Now, Secretary of State of the United States is probably the hardest job in the American. The president can sleep for 2 or 3 hours a day if he so wishes. He can go and play golf if he so wishes. Secretary of State, you never see them playing golf, or you very rarely do. You very rarely see them because you've got to be across every single foreign relation that America has, and that's 152 countries. That's everyone. You know, in Australia, you might not need to know what's happening so much in Gaborone in Botswana, but in the United States, you've got to know who the boss is, who's in charge, who's not. And to have drunks, Pete Hegseth as Secretary for Defence, Chief of the Military.
Secretary of War, actually.
Secretary of War, I'm sorry. But perpetually drunk, it seems. Obviously I can't diagnose that, but people who've seen him say these aren't the actions of a sober person. Kirsty Noem finally got sacked from Justice. When you surround yourself by idiots, it doesn't matter how smart you are, they will drag you down to your level and beat you with experience. And if you're not terribly competent yourself, that's not such a hard job to do. So to start a war, and even things like someone pointed out, when George W. Bush, hardly the president that we point to when we talk about proper and ethical behaviour, but when he sent the troops to war, he said, I'm not playing golf while there are troops over there dying. I don't think it's right. Good grief. Doesn't absolve him from all the other horrible things he did. But at least that showed some understanding of the commitment of the troops. Trump turns up to a funeral in his MAGA cap, didn't take his hat off, to a serviceman's funeral in the state, which is about the most highest ritual you can do in the States. And I know that you'll say, it's not a Christian nation, surely a mass or something. No, those funerals are very important. You note that they never, ever make fun of them, and so Trump turning up in the hat and not taking it off. Like he might have needed the hat because the sun was in his eyes or something, but there comes a point where you take the hat off. You suffer this mild discomfort because it's nowhere near the discomfort the person in the coffin has suffered. It's like the Australian liberal politicians hold their hand over the heart. So it's not about us. We don't do that here. You look like an idiot doing it. I'd never say that to an American politician and certainly not an American serviceman, because it's an American tradition, and that's great. We're allowed our own traditions. It's like Anzac Day here. We're allowed to do that. It's Trump having surrounded himself with people who don't know and who can't even advise him on protocol, it seems. If you wrote this as a sitcom, say, or like Veep, you'd throw most of it out for being too outlandish. But here we are. We live in a post-sitcom world.
But speaking of people that don't really know what they're doing, and if you don't really know what you're doing, there's all these other unintended consequences that will arise from all of this. And one of the unintended consequences is related to artificial intelligence. And the United States, and this feeds back into the economy as well, but the United States has been pushing hard into AI technology, building all of those massive data centers, and a lot of people have invested into companies such as OpenAI. And there is a large tech bubble that's developing there, which is a separate issue. But the point is that the United States, if it's pushing for the AI industry and AI technology, well, that's what their agenda is, and they're heavily dependent on Taiwan for the production of computer chips. And Taiwan is the largest manufacturer of computer chips. And this war with Iran, that's creating supply chain issues for Taiwan, and it cannot produce the chips quickly enough to supply the United States. And if you're trying to be at the forefront of AI development and technology and you haven't got the hardware to back it up, well, you know, I'm not really that much of a tech person, but I can tell you that you're going to have problems there. And this is just another way of the United States shooting itself, and Donald Trump of shooting itself in the foot. And China has already developed AI technology that probably uses around 1% of the processing power of other forms of AI. It's around between 1 and 5%. So the United States is already behind in this tech race, and now it's going to be even further behind. And even if this war ends tomorrow, the disruption is going to continue for some time. So it's going to be maybe 6 months further behind China as far as the AI technology is concerned.
Yeah, it's insane. And I keep seeing AI is done, AI is finished, and certainly there's a lot of slop that goes out there, and there's a lot of people who don't know how to use it properly and use it for things that it shouldn't be used for. And I don't even mean morally bad things. Should it be deciding on whether someone lives or dies in a hospital or anything like that, which is morally questionable. But people using it to try and disguise their own lack of thinking.
Or to suggest that Benjamin Netanyahu is still alive through
dead.
fake AI videos.
Oh, sorry, yeah, still alive. Yeah, exactly. For grunt work, to stuff that makes our lives easier, yeah, great. Diagnosing, getting options for what's wrong with your car if you're a mechanic, and I suppose even feeding in somebody's symptoms into an AI if you're a doctor. But then at the end, I've got to critically think through these results and work out, do any of these actually fit? In that kind of way of saving time rather than, okay, we can use that.
There are going to be a lot of industrial issues to come out of AI technology through unemployment and stuff like that. And also there's the environmental costs of AI development as well. But my point is, if the United States sees itself as the forefront and the innovator in AI technology, well, it's not going to happen if you're not getting the hardware support behind you.
Yeah, and if you block off the manufacturer of the chips, either you start making the chips yourself, which will take at least 3 years to set up the factories and the technology and the research and development and the reverse engineering and all of that stuff that they need to do it, or you find yourself in trouble. And they're not keen in America in building infrastructure for some reason. So they better work out some way of transporting oil from the Middle East that doesn't involve the Middle East. Good luck with that.
We're running a lot of scenarios at the moment, as you'd expect. We ordinarily would be in the lead up to the budget, but especially at a time of heightened global volatility and uncertainty. What unites what the Governor was saying and in the statement as well, and the private sector economists and certainly the government understands that there is so much unpredictability in the world right now. And yes, we had an inflation challenge before the hostilities in the Middle East escalated dramatically a couple of weeks ago. But though that escalation has made some of our economic challenges harder, and it's certainly dialed up all of this global uncertainty, which is playing out in every country, including ours.
And just swinging all of this back to Australia, because there is going to be a local economic impact, and people in Australia are already starting to feel that, mainly at the petrol bowser, but that will transfer into the rest of the economy. And we had the Treasurer Jim Chalmers pointing to the war in Iran as a key driver behind rising interest rates. Now, tell us a different story, please. But this is what all politicians are going to do. They'll look for external causes when there's a lot of structural problem.
No, hold on. No. Let's be fair to Jim. I bought the Sydney Harbour Bridge off him the other day. The tolls are going up.
Good luck with that. But all this sort of stuff is always going to be used. External causes are going to be used as an excuse when there's a lot of structural problems within the economy that have been there for about 20 years or so, or even longer. But the reality is that this kind of oil price shock, well, it does filter through to everything. Transport costs rise, production costs go up, food prices go up, and sometimes it is used as an excuse for price gouging, but it's all still interrelated. And now there's talk about a recession being brought on by this war in Iran, and that doesn't necessarily mean a catastrophe, but it does need to be managed carefully politically and economically. But the problem is that a short-term solution is not going to be a quick fix. And I don't know if there are short-term solutions. There's going to be there has to be a lot of reforms to the economy to make it more sustainable and cater for these shocks that are going to happen from time to time that we've got absolutely no control over. And one of the issues that the Labor government is talking about right now is reforms to capital gains tax and negative gearing. And it might not seem like there's a relationship to making the overall economy stable right now, but that's the sort of thing that does make the economy stronger in the long term. So it's not all dependent on housing speculation. But, sure, it's not going to help right now. But then there's energy policy. That's a long-term fix as well, where if the economy is less reliant on fossil fuel resources coming from the Middle East, and if we fast track the renewable transition that should have started many years ago instead of arguing over nuclear energy and whether we'd be saying goodbye to the weekend because of electric vehicles, well, maybe we'd just be in a far more resilient position. There's also gas reservation policies, and that's been delayed for decades. Although the federal government is now talking about a 20% reserve, maybe 25% for the domestic market instead of selling it overseas. So these are the sort of long-term policies that should have been instigated a long, long time ago, David, and we didn't. And I think we're now paying the price for it. And I'm not suggesting that we wouldn't have been affected by this war at all in Iran if we had had these long-term policies implemented a long time ago. But I'd suggest that the effects would not be as severe as they are today and will be over the next few months.
Yeah, if the government is brave, we'll get through it. And the precedent is Kevin Rudd and Wayne Swan saying, right, here's $1,000 to everyone. Go and spend it. We're going to build, every school in Australia is getting a new school hall, whether they want it or not. And that avoided the last world recession for Australia, one of only 3 countries or 2 countries in the world to do so. I hope that, and having ribbed him earlier, I hope that Jim Chalmers is brave enough. I think he is. To say, and the solution might not be just doling out cash. There may be something. It might be just infrastructure building. It might be giving money to subsidising grocery prices or subsidising fuel prices in the way that medicine is subsidised, removing the tax from fuel for a few months, so it goes down to 60 cents a litre rather than $2.60 a litre or whatever the price is, and bringing in severe legislation that means that if the companies try and gouge that, they get punished for it. That you put a cap, anything you charge over this is taxed at 100%. No deductions, nothing. Fuel will be done at $1 a litre, say, or 60 cents a litre, which will help keep prices down, which will help with... That's one of 1,000 solutions. It's probably not even the best one.
Well, they're all great short-term solutions, but there also has to, in conjunction with that, there has to be these long-term economic solutions. This is the time for Jim Chalmers to step up, I guess. This is his moment. Never waste a crisis, as they say in politics.
Yeah. And your legacy is determined by what you do, not by what you say, not by what you said you were going to do, not by what you wanted to do, but what you did. And Labor will remember the great legacies. It's a difference between Billy Hughes and Mark Latham and Gough Whitlam and Bob Hawke. You want to fall closer to the Whitlam-Hawke side of things than the Hughes-Latham side of things. It's time for small thinking to go away and big thinking to come in, followed by big actions, I think. We've been waiting for this government to become the reformist government we voted for. Now would be a good time.
But I guess a lot of this exposes the deeper contradictions. If we're looking at the bigger pictures or the bigger thinking, it exposes the deeper contradictions within the international system. And with that third wave of globalisation that was supposed to make interdependence within countries or with countries a strength, where different countries all have to rely on each other, well, that's a 21st century modern way of looking at global economies. But the dilemma for me is, or the contradiction is, that we've still got these political systems that are based on 19th century sort of thinking, 19th century imperialism. You know, there's the conflict, there's all the rivalry between the big countries, and now we've got the disruption. And that makes that idea of globalisation pretty much useless within the current geopolitical structure that we've got. And in the absence of a more sophisticated geopolitical system, I guess the question is, should countries become more self-sufficient with their energy support? And it's a bit of a tall order right now, because we've had those 20 wasted years over climate and energy wars, which sort of related to the culture wars as well. And just as an example, I've got a friend who's got a BYD car, also got a home battery and solar paneling. Now, all of this did cost a little bit of money, and not everyone's in that position to be able to do this. But while everyone else is paying their $3 a litre in Sydney, well, he's driving around his car in Sydney for the cost of $0. And I guess this is what innovation could look like. And instead, Australia remains heavily dependent on fossil fuels, the related vested interests. And history has shown that sometimes it takes a big shock to force a change. And in the 1973 oil crisis, we were just little kids then, but you know, that forced massive changes within the European car industry. People couldn't afford to use the bigger and heavier cars, so they focused the car market on smaller and more fuel efficient cars. So that could happen again, forcing the market into battery cars rather than petrol cars. But the big question is always going to be, do we learn from history? And so far, in most cases, we haven't been prepared to learn from history. You know, you talked about the idea of big thinking. Like, this is where big thinking could take
And
us.
it's not even that big thinking, because the idea's been around for decades. Why isn't Australia as one of the sunniest countries in the world? And we have this massive desert where it rains once every 3 years. But also the light here in the southern hemisphere is different. And so the sun is more efficient. And I don't know the science. I've read the science, but I didn't absorb it. But Australia could be a world leader. It could be the Middle East of solar power, if it so wanted. Churning up the batteries, exporting them. Seems a bit stupid when everybody has pretty much the same access to the sun in many ways. But
Well, Anthony Albanese did talk about Australia becoming the renewable energy superpower in 2022 and 2025. Where is it?
yeah, these things take time, but we should be at least seeing the start of this is what we're doing and this is how we're doing it. And then every few months, a new step in the process is finished. And within, I don't know if it take 2 years, 3 years or 5 years, it's done. And then Australia suddenly is a power or an energy superpower commensurate with our political mid-power and major power in the region. But we're still very much tied up with coal and oil mining here. A lot of people pointed out that most of our oil comes from Korea and Singapore, but the qualification there is that they refine the oil. It still comes from the Middle East. There is the argument Australia has plenty of natural oil. Why don't we use that? Is mining such a good thing to rely on environmental? So it's not quite as simple as, let's just dig up our oil. It's everything comes with not just a monetary cost, but a physical and a moral and an ethical cost. But yeah, the sun just shines down. If you get too much sun, you get sunburn. If you don't get enough sun, you get a vitamin D deficiency, but mostly it's harmless. We should be looking at sun, and the other one is wind. We're not the windiest country in the world, but we got enough of it that we could really generate stuff and send to countries that might not have the same access to the sun, rainier countries and countries that we don't want to offend our miners for some reason, which are just the people we should be helping manage out and helping, even if we have to help them transition from mining to solar power. That's better than not doing anything.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you value independent journalism without the influence of corporate backing, join New Politics at newpolitics.com.au and support us directly. It's just $5 per month, and we always try to keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.